I know it hurts, friend. But you're not alone. We're right here with you.
What would you do if, one cold spring night, you heard soft knocking sounds from the woods behind your home? Not footsteps, not a predator. Just a quiet rhythm, like someone or something trying not to disturb you. Caleb, an aging farmer in Idaho's North Fork Valley, chose to find out. Alone on a failing hay farm, burdened with debt and grief over the loss of his daughter, he ventured into the forest with only a lantern and an old shotgun. What he found was not a monster, but a wounded, pregnant Bigfoot, bleeding, silent, and staring at him not with rage, but with a plea for mercy. What followed was not a legend, but a quiet, real bond built on mutual respect. And one day, that silent act of kindness would return to Caleb in a way no one, not even he, could have imagined. This story is not just about mystery. It's about healing, boundaries, and how compassion can echo beyond species, beyond logic. And I want to ask you, dear friend, where are you watching this from? What's your name? And how far do you think this story can travel? From the bottom of my heart, thank you for being here. If this story touches something in you, please consider liking the video and subscribing. Together, we can build a community that believes Bigfoot isn't just a myth, but maybe, just maybe, a reminder that kindness never disappears. There were nights when the silence of the farm didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a sentence being carried out, slow and steady, dragging across time like the sound of boots through wet gravel. Nights when the wind curled under the eaves but didn't howl, just pressed its weight against the walls like it was listening. Nights when Caleb Rourke stood on the porch long after his coffee had gone cold, holding the mug with both hands as if its empty weight could anchor him to something solid. The spring of 1989 had come late and bitter. Snowmelt left the ground saturated and the fields slick, trapping the roots of dead grass and stealing the color from everything. His hay crop had barely sprouted last year, and this season looked worse. One of the tractors gave out 2 weeks ago. The other made a sound like it was begging to be put down. He'd patched fence after fence, and still the wire sagged like tired lungs. The notice from the bank was clipped under a horseshoe magnet on the fridge, though he didn't need to read it again. 2 months, the letter said. 2 months, or they'd come out and take what was left. He didn't curse about it. Didn't punch walls or yell at God. He just didn't sit at the kitchen table much anymore. Out in the pasture, the barn leaned on itself like an old man with a broken hip. A decade ago, it had been red. Now it was the color of flaking rust and faded loss. The stalls were mostly empty. A mule too old to work, a cow too skinny to sell. The rest he'd had to let go. He didn't talk about the girl. Folks in North Fork Valley had learned not to ask. 8 years old, hair like wind through wheat, drowned in the irrigation canal during a heat wave summer that never seemed to end. Her name wasn't spoken in the house anymore, not out loud. But sometimes, when Caleb passed by the edge of the canal, his boots would slow, just a fraction, and he'd stare longer than needed, as if waiting for something to come up from the dark water and speak her name for him. He still wore his wedding ring. Nobody mentioned that either. One afternoon, he drove into town in his battered Ford, the one that squealed in protest with every mile. He parked beside Doss General and stepped inside, nodding at the bell above the door. The store smelled like flour and wood polish, like a time before mortgages and regrets.
2 feet long.
Mabel Doss was behind the counter, her silver hair pinned up in a no-nonsense coil. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. "You need more feed?" she asked, not even looking up. "Yeah," Caleb replied. His voice was gravel low. "And coffee, whatever's cheapest." Mabel marked it in her ledger without a word about payment. Caleb had been buying on credit longer than either of them liked. But she never made him ask. A small pair of feet scurried behind one of the shelves, and Ivy Doss peeked out with a cautious grin, holding a loaf of bread wrapped in brown paper. 11 years old, all skinny limbs and curious eyes. She waved the loaf at him like it was an offering. "Gran says you like rye better than white," she said. Caleb gave her a half smile. "She's right. I baked it with her," Ivy added, proud. He nodded once. "Tastes better that way." Then he left. No need for more words than that. That night, sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, Caleb heard the first cry. It wasn't loud, not at first, but it cut through the stillness like something sharp and frayed. He sat up in bed, heart punching in his chest, and listened. It wasn't the high-pitched wail of a cougar, nor the bark of a fox. This sound was heavier, slower, like someone trying to scream through broken ribs. Then it stopped. He pulled on his boots, grabbed the old lantern, and walked the perimeter of the house. The night was thick with fog, coiled around the trees like breath that refused to rise. Out by the paddock, the mule stood still, not nervous, not pacing, just alert. Eyes wide, ears turned toward the backwoods. Whatever had made that sound, it hadn't stirred panic in the animals. Only silence. That was what stuck with Caleb as he walked back inside. The kind of silence that didn't belong in spring. The next day passed like most, slow, gray, 100 chores that meant nothing if the land refused to yield. That night, the cry came again. This time, it was closer, a choked sound. Not animal, not human. Something between. It started low, then rose like someone trying not to weep. Caleb stood at the window, the lantern unlit in his hand. He didn't go out this time. Not yet. He left the porch light on, just in case. On the third night, the sound returned. Closer again, right behind the barn. Caleb stepped outside, lantern lit. The beam cut through the mist and brushed against the far end of the fence line. For a breathless moment, the sound stopped. Clean cut, like it had been listening. He walked toward the barn, slow. No sudden moves. That's when he saw it. Just beyond the irrigation ditch, there were prints in the mud. Huge. Deeper than any boot he'd ever worn. The kind of depth that only weight and time could press into earth like that. But they stopped at the edge of the canal. Didn't cross, didn't trespass. He looked up and saw nothing, heard nothing. But the prints were fresh. The next morning he found something else. Just past the barn, there were scratch marks along a tree trunk. Not claw marks, not gouges. More like something had dragged metal across the bark. Ragged and deliberate. Nearby, a rusted bit of trap chain lay half buried in the moss. Fresh blood. Not much, but enough. Caleb stared at it for a long time. Then, without a word, he kicked a pile of straw over it and kept walking. That evening he didn't eat. Just brewed coffee and sat on the porch long past dark. The cup steamed for a while. Then it cooled. He held it anyway, watching the dark edge of the woods, listening for something that might or might not return. A breeze moved through the bare limbs of the maple near the canal. The porch light flickered once. Far off, the mule gave a soft grunt, and in that hush, that silence thick enough to carry weight, Caleb whispered toward the tree line. "Don't die alone out there." He didn't know who he was speaking to. Maybe no one. Maybe himself. But as he set the mug down and leaned forward, elbows on knees, his fingers twitched slightly, like they were remembering what it felt like to hold on to something that mattered. And somewhere, out past the line of sight, deep in the trees, something heard. Something waited. And something chose not to cross. Not yet, because there are places in the world that don't forgive. But sometimes, just sometimes, they remember who tried. The nights didn't let him rest after that. 3 hours past midnight, the house would still be dark. Save for the soft orange flicker of the lantern Caleb kept burning low by the kitchen sink. The rest of the place stayed hushed, suspended in that stillness only a man who lived alone could understand. It wasn't peace. It was something heavier. Something watching from behind the tree line, patient as time. On the fifth night, he saddled up with purpose. The rifle, old but clean, hung across his back, lantern in one hand, canteen strapped to his side. He didn't leave a note, didn't need to. There wasn't anyone left to find one. The cold wasn't sharp that night, just stubborn, like it had settled in the dirt and meant to stay. Caleb stepped out past the porch light and kept going until even its glow vanished behind him. The woods didn't greet him. No wind, no owls, just branches barely moving, like they were listening. The further in he walked, the more the noise of the world thinned. Even his boots, usually too loud on packed earth, seemed to tread softer here, like the forest demanded it, demanded reverence. He paused near a grove of tamarack trees, where moss draped like shawls across twisted trunks. That's when he heard it again. Not loud, not wild, just worn. A sound stretched too thin across pain. It didn't echo. It stayed right there in the trees, waiting. He raised the lantern. That was the first time he saw her, leaning against a trunk not 20 yards ahead. Huge, hunched. Her coat was matted with mud and old blood, thick across her left side. One hand clutched her belly, not protectively, but tiredly. Her breath came in slow, hollow wheezes. Steam curled up and vanished before it could touch the branches above. His fingers slid toward the rifle out of instinct. But then she lifted her head and didn't meet his eyes. She turned her face, slow, deliberate, like someone offering the back of their neck. She didn't bare teeth, didn't growl, just accepted whatever he might do, like she'd already seen too much to flinch anymore. Caleb froze. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was something closer to shame. He let go of the gun. He reached instead for the canteen and set it down in the dirt, then took a single step back. His boot crunched softly over a fallen branch, but the sound didn't startle her. She didn't move, just looked at the canteen for a long time. Then, with a motion so slow it might have been ceremonial, she reached forward and pulled it close. She drank like someone taught not to waste. He didn't say a word, just stood there, lantern held steady, shadows flickering across the line of her jaw. The way her chest rose and fell, the way her fingers twitched after each sip. It all felt too human to name. But he knew better than to try and name her. After a while, she shifted her weight. Tried to stand straighter, but failed. Her leg trembled and gave out. Caleb moved forward by instinct, but she growled then. Not loud, just low and firm. A warning without malice. He stopped, raised his palms. Then she did something that hollowed the breath right out of him. She looked to the left, toward the barn, toward the one place with shelter, heat, and straw. Then she looked back at him, eyes not pleading, not commanding, just waiting. He understood. He turned and walked ahead, holding the lantern up. Behind him, he heard her follow, but not closely. Her steps were heavy, spaced apart, one dragging slightly. She was injured, but still proud, still refusing to be carried. By the time they reached the edge of the pasture, Caleb felt sweat under his collar, cold and uncomfortable. He turned to check on her. She'd stopped at the tree line, not moving. The porch light spilled across part of the yard in a thin arc. She stood just beyond it, waiting. He tilted the lantern downward, shielding it with his coat, casting the whole space in deeper dark. Only then did she cross. Not quickly, not desperate, just steady. She stopped at the barn door and leaned a hand against it, breathing rough. Caleb pushed the door open, stepped aside, and let the scent of musty hay drift out. She didn't enter right away. She stared into the dark interior for a beat, then reached up and touched the frame. 3 fingers pressed lightly against the weathered wood. A gesture. Not for him. For something older. Then she stepped inside. Caleb lit the oil lamp hanging just inside the barn, setting it low. The space glowed in amber. Dust floated like snowfall through it. The place hadn't been used in years, but it still held the memory of shelter, of foals born and lost, of calves fed through blizzards, of life surviving when it shouldn't have. She found the corner where the hay was driest and collapsed onto one knee. Caleb didn't move. He stood by the door, watching. Her breathing had grown more ragged. And then he saw it, the metal glint. A piece of a jaw trap, its rusted teeth still latched into her upper thigh. Blood had clotted thick around it, but infection would be a matter of time. He stepped forward. She growled again, softer this time. He held up both hands, then knelt slowly, setting the lantern between them. He didn't touch her, just looked. The wound wasn't fresh, maybe a few days old, but the swelling around it told him what he needed to know. He spoke now, not for her understanding, but because the silence felt too sharp. "Someone sat that close," he muttered. "Real close." She didn't respond, just closed her eyes for a moment. Caleb eased back, letting her breathe. Then he stood, grabbed an old tarp, and began spreading it over the floor on the other side of the barn, across from her. No sudden moves, no staring, just working. He laid down a pile of straw, brought a bucket of water and set it within reach, grabbed a bushel of last year's apples, half rotted but some still good, and rolled one near her side. She sniffed at it, then took it gently, teeth barely making sound. When he returned with a blanket, she watched him the whole time. He didn't drape it over her, just left it folded near the wall. That night, he didn't close the barn door. She could leave if she wanted. He walked back toward the house with the lantern swaying gently in his grip. The pasture behind him went silent again. But this time, it wasn't empty. This time, something else breathed there with purpose. Later that night, just before sleep took him, he heard it. A sound from the barn, 3 knocks on wood, light, measured. Then nothing. He stared at the ceiling until dawn, the shape of those knocks echoing in his chest. The next morning he checked the barn before even thinking of coffee. She was asleep, or something close to it, curled slightly inward, one arm crossed over her chest. The blanket had been moved, not used, just nudged toward her, like a question. He didn't step inside. He just stood at the threshold, watching her chest rise and fall. And for the first time in years, he felt the air in his lungs steady. Not lighter, but more honest. The forest didn't forgive. He knew that. But maybe it remembered kindness. And maybe, just maybe, something out there still knew his name. He closed the barn door quietly, not to shut her in, but to keep the world out. The morning after she entered the barn, Caleb stood at the door and didn't cross the threshold. He didn't need to. From where he stood, he could hear her breathing, deep, labored, deliberate. The scent of sweat, fur, and damp straw hung in the air, earthy but not unpleasant. He waited a moment, eyes adjusting to the amber light still flickering low inside, and then turned away. There was work to do. The barn hadn't seen real purpose in years, not since the last of the cattle were sold off. But now, under that sagging roof, something unspoken had taken root. It wasn't trust. Not quite, but it was something close enough to build on. He started with the basics. The windbreak on the west wall had rotted out, letting cold creep in at night. Caleb ripped down the loose boards, hammered in fresh planks scavenged from the old shed, sealed the edges with tar paper he found curled behind the grain bin. The sounds of hammering echoed soft across the pasture. Inside, she didn't move. She just listened. He brought out new straw. Not much left, but enough to freshen the corner she'd claimed. The tarp stayed, stained and rumpled, but she didn't complain. Didn't resist. When he added a dented metal water bowl and filled it fresh from the pump, she dragged it an inch closer to herself, using the back of her hand. She didn't speak, but everything she did felt intentional, like she understood the shape of gestures. He cleaned the old propane heater, tested it on the porch to make sure it didn't leak, then rolled it into the barn and placed it well off to the side. She watched from her corner, eyes steady, but not hostile, when it hissed to life and threw off its first warmth. She blinked slowly. Caleb didn't smile, but a weight shifted in his chest just the same. He brought her food the way he would for a wounded stray, plain, nourishing, unassuming. Boiled potatoes with the skins on, apples, cooked oats left warm in a tin bowl, a second bucket of water, this time mixed with a pinch of salt. She took her time eating, always with her back to the wall, body angled just slightly away from him. She never turned her full face toward him. And when she was weakest, she looked at the ground. That evening, Ivy came walking up the gravel path like she always did on Saturdays, swinging a canvas bag too big for her shoulders. The sun dipped low behind her, catching in her braids and throwing long shadows across the porch. Caleb saw her coming and felt a ripple of uncertainty rise in his gut. She reached the steps, breathless. Gran sent eggs and rye rolls. I made the butter. It's not salty, though. Caleb took the bag, nodded. Thank you. Ivy squinted past him toward the barn. You've been fixing it up? A little. Is something sick? His eyes met hers for just a second. Then he shook his head. Just patching things before winter. She didn't press. Just handed him a folded envelope with her name written in perfect cursive. Can you mail this next time you go to town? I will. She stood for another minute, not quite ready to leave. Her eyes searched his face, quietly reading something he didn't say. Then she smiled, wide and crooked. You don't look tired today. Caleb didn't answer, just held the bag a little tighter. That night, after the sun dropped behind the ridge and the first cold settled into the dirt, he stood outside the barn, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee. Through the gap in the door, he could see her silhouette, broad, unmoving, curled in on itself but upright. The propane heater glowed soft beside her. It made the barn look warmer than it was. She hadn't crossed the straw line he laid between their spaces. He hadn't told her to stay behind it. But she understood. Boundaries, once felt, didn't need words. He stepped closer, then stopped. Something had changed. The straw. It was rearranged, still in her corner, still thick and warm, but now shaped deliberately. Half a circle carved out near the wall, the rest stacked around it like a nest. There was a pattern, a place reserved. Empty. He stared at it for a long time. That night, when he returned to the house, he didn't sleep. He sat at the table, drinking coffee gone cold, listening to the soft rustle of wind against the barn door. At some point, he heard it again, faint but clear. 3 knocks, slow, steady, then 1, then 3 again. He rose from the table and went to the window, pulled the curtain back. Nothing stirred, just the trees, holding their breath. The next morning, he saw something pressed into the barn floor. On the dusty side wall near the heater, someone, or something, had run a fingertip through soot and left faint markings. Not words, not pictures, just lines, measured, curved. He didn't wipe them away. That afternoon, he drove into town. Not for supplies, not even for the post office. He just needed to see something familiar. A few men stood out front of Richie's hardware store, talking over a busted generator in the back of a Chevy. A voice carried across the street, sharp, bragging. Biggest damn thing I've ever seen. Took the bait like it hadn't eaten in weeks. Caleb slowed. Dale Rusk leaned against the truck, boots muddy, eyes gleaming. He was pantomiming a wide stance, mimicking something lunging from the brush. Caught the thing scent again out by Glen Creek, Dale said, spitting. Not just a bear. Something else. Tracks like a goddamn man, but heavier. The men laughed, but uneasily. Caleb walked on. The back of his neck prickled. By dusk, he was home again. He brought the barn a fresh armful of hay, a tin of baked squash, and a wool blanket. As he opened the door, the smell hit him first, cleaner. The air inside had shifted. Not fresher exactly, but more deliberate. She was standing now, not fully upright, but taller than he remembered. Her frame filled the back half of the barn, shadowed but unmoving. She looked at the food, then at him. Still didn't meet his eyes. He backed away without speaking. That night, he dreamed of his daughter again. Not her face, just the sound of her crying behind a locked bathroom door. He remembered waiting outside, hand pressed to the wood, not knocking, just waiting, giving her space, respecting what she needed. In the morning, the markings on the wall had changed. More lines, this time intersecting. A faint triangle, a curve, a deliberate break in one section. He didn't touch it. He made fresh coffee, left a bowl near the barn door. She didn't drink it, but she watched him from the shadows, never blinking. There was something in her silence that mirrored his own. Something he couldn't name. Not yet. That afternoon, he heard tires on gravel, looked out the window. Dale Rusk's truck, coasting slow past the property line. He didn't stop, just lingered, eyes on the barn. Then he drove on. Caleb walked the fence that night, checking every post. The wire had started to sag near the south end. He marked it for repair. As he turned to head back, something caught his ear. Soft, dull, hollow. 3 knocks, then silence. He didn't speak, didn't call out. But as he stepped back onto the porch, he felt the night press close again, like it was waiting. He stood there a while longer, hand resting on the wood railing. The house behind him was still. The barn was quiet. And somewhere between them, something sacred was beginning to take shape. Not with words, not with trust, but with distance respected, with silence honored, and with the quiet understanding that neither one of them was entirely alone anymore. The cold came without warning. One morning, Caleb stepped out onto the porch, and his breath coiled instantly in front of him. Not wispy, but heavy, like smoke from a slow-burning fire. The frost clung to the steps, to the wheelbarrow handles, to the worn handle of the water pump like it meant to make a home there. Ice glazed the trough. He knew then what kind of storm was coming. Not snow. Worse, a hard freeze wrapped in rain. The kind of storm that laid trees down like matchsticks and split power lines without a sound. That afternoon, the sky turned to lead. A strange color, not just gray but bruised, as if something behind the clouds was pressing inward. The wind never howled. It hissed, sharp, sideways, steady. Caleb fed the mule and latched the barn, then moved quietly through the motions of survival. He filled the kettles, brought in wood, lit the stove early, and when the first drops came, they didn't splash. They hissed on the windows, then stuck. Rain that froze before it had the chance to fall. By late evening, the land had gone quiet. Ice clung to the telephone wires like a second skin. Trees creaked under its weight, their branches bowing low, some snapping like bones in the far dark. The world had gone still in that tense, electric way, like it was holding a breath it couldn't afford to exhale. Caleb sat at the table with a kerosene lamp casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. The power had flickered twice and died for good an hour ago. He didn't miss it. The lantern was warmer, steadier, older than anything plugged in. He poured a mug of coffee and held it to his lips, then stopped. A sound, not loud, but deep, not outside, from the barn. He was already pulling on his coat before the mug hit the table. The wind slammed into him when he opened the door, sheets of freezing rain needling into his face and throat. He yanked his collar high, gripped the lantern tight, and pushed forward, boots crunching across the icy path. The barn glowed faintly ahead, its slats creaking against the wind. But the noise inside, that was what cut through. She was in labor. By the time he reached the door, he could hear her breathing. Harsh, rhythmic, not panicked, just focused. Caleb stepped inside and shut the door behind him, cutting out the wind like closing a chapter. The propane heater had died. Somewhere in the early hours, it must have sputtered out. Cold seeped in fast. She lay curled in the farthest corner of the stall, muscles taut, one arm gripped against the straw. There was no blood. Not yet. But something in the way her body shook, in the low guttural sounds in her throat. It struck him harder than he expected. She didn't call to him. She didn't beg. She just lay there, enduring. And he knew that pain. The kind where no one else could do a damn thing but be present. He moved fast. He didn't ask, just acted. Clean towels from the storage bin. The thermos of boiled water still warm. Rags, salt, his oldest pair of shears. He kept his hands steady, kept his breath slow. This wasn't the first time he'd stood beside something that didn't know if it could survive the next hour. But it was the first time it looked at him and waited for permission. She watched him come closer and didn't flinch. He knelt slowly, one knee in the straw, and spoke. Not with words, but with pace. Every motion measured, audible, deliberate. He set the towels beside her, moved the water in reach, spread fresh hay. She shifted slightly, drawing one leg up, exposing the round swell of her belly. Caleb caught his breath. The contractions came faster now. Her body arched, not violently, but with a kind of force that left no room for doubt. Caleb could see the shape now, moving low, almost crowned. But something was wrong. The movement paused, stilled, pressed, but didn't emerge. She grunted, a low tremor in her throat, and clutched the earth like it might forgive her. He knew the signs: a stalled birth, breech, or tangled. Maybe the cord, maybe worse. He didn't hesitate. He moved in, slow but certain. One hand braced against her thigh, the other reaching forward. Coated in salt water, knuckles raw from cold. She didn't fight. She didn't even breathe. Caleb reached in, found the shape, and guided gently, carefully, inch by inch. The form slid forward. A rush of warmth followed. But the creature lay still, small gray, wet, limp. Caleb's heart stopped. She watched him, eyes wide, unmoving. He didn't think. He just acted. He lifted the newborn, cleared the nose, opened the mouth. Nothing. He tilted the head back, rubbed the chest. Still nothing. His hands shook now. He wrapped the body in a dry towel and leaned close, pressing 2 fingers against the rib cage. Come on. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. Then, a twitch. A gasp, wet, high-pitched, unsure. The creature jerked once, then again. Its chest fluttered. Breath caught, then held. Caleb froze. Behind him, she let out a sound he'd never heard. Not relief, not thanks. Something older, something sacred. She pulled the newborn close, holding it gently but fiercely, tucking it against her chest with trembling fingers. Caleb backed away, heart still hammering. The wind outside screamed against the walls, and then he felt it. A presence. He turned slow. Outside the barn's broken back panel, just past the fence line, a figure stood tall and still in the freezing rain. Massive, broader than the doorway. Its fur glistened with ice. It didn't move forward, didn't growl, just watched. It had come, not to interfere, but to witness. The porch lantern had gone out. There was no line of light, only darkness. But even then, it didn't cross. It just stood at the edge of the world, as if guarding, as if waiting to see what kind of man Caleb Rourke had become. Inside, the child let out a cry, short, sharp, alive, and the figure outside lifted its arm. 3 knuckles rapped slow against the nearest tree, then 1, then 3 again. Caleb stood frozen in place, his breath shallow, his eyes stinging. The storm howled louder. The wind lashed sideways, and then the figure stepped back, into the dark, gone. He didn't follow. He didn't close the barn door. He turned instead, leaned against the stall, and watched the mother rock slightly, cradling the newborn in her lap. Her shoulders eased. Her breathing slowed. For the first time since she arrived, her gaze met his. Not for long, just long enough to remember the shape of mercy. Her hand reached out, 2 fingers extended. She touched his wrist. Not to take, not to mark, just to acknowledge. Caleb looked down at her hand. The same kind of roughness, the same scars, calluses, old wounds healed wrong. He nodded once, then stood and walked out, the freezing rain slicing across his skin, soaking through to the bone. The world outside had turned to glass. The trees bowed low, roads sealed in crystal. His porch creaked under a thin coat of ice. Power was out across the whole valley. No lights, no radio, just cold. But the barn glowed, warm, alive. Later, inside the house, Caleb stripped off his wet coat and sat in front of the stove. The fire hissed, spit, flared. He poured the last of the coffee and drank it lukewarm. On the table beside him, one of Ivy's hand-rolled candles flickered. He didn't speak. But in the silence, something shifted. Not in the world. In him. Because sometimes, a man doesn't rescue to feel strong. Sometimes he does it because he remembers what it was like to watch someone slip away and be too late. This time he wasn't. And somewhere, in the heart of a storm that had taken power, roads, trees, and time itself, life had come back and left its mark. The storm passed in the night, not with a final roar, but with a long sigh, as if the valley itself had been holding its breath and finally let it out. Morning broke slow and blue, the kind of light that didn't warm anything, just peeled back the dark. Caleb stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the trees sag under coats of ice. His breath fogged the glass. The power hadn't come back. The lines hung dead, glittering like string lights at the end of the world. He hadn't slept. Not because of worry, but because something inside him refused to let go of the sound that baby had made. Raw, defiant, alive. He stepped outside. The porch steps crackled under his boots, the air brittle. He walked toward the barn, slow, eyes moving across the land like someone relearning it. The ice glinted off the roof. A branch lay snapped across the path, clean as bone. The door was already cracked open. He paused, not in fear, but something colder than that. The barn was empty. No warmth, no movement, no sound. Only the faint trace of straw shifted. A pile rearranged, the tarp folded too neatly. He stepped inside. His breath caught in the back of his throat. Everything had been returned. The stall had been swept. The food bowls cleaned and stacked against the wall. The extra blankets folded into the old trunk he never locked. The propane heater had been moved back to its corner. The water bucket was empty, but polished somehow. No trace of mud, no stray hairs, no prints. Like nothing had happened, like they'd never been there at all. But he knew better. The smells still lingered faintly. The air still felt different. And in the far corner, in the softest straw, he found it. An indentation, small and round, barely the size of a child's cradle. He didn't speak. He stood for a long time, hand braced on the doorframe, eyes searching for something he couldn't name. Then he stepped out into the cold and looked toward the tree line. No movement, no sound. But there, just along the ridge, he saw the faintest trail of impressions in the snow. Not footprints, not human. Wide, soft, spaced far apart. Leading away. Not a goodbye. Just gone. That afternoon, he returned to the barn with a shovel and cleared the doorway. Ice had sealed the threshold. He chipped it loose, not in a hurry. The motion helped. Inside, he didn't clean anything else. Just left it the way it was, like a room paused in time. When he turned to leave, his eyes caught something faint scratched into the wood near the stall. Not a word. Not a symbol he knew. Just a smudge. A mark from a finger run through the soot. A single curve. A second just beside it. The impression of a closed eye. He didn't wipe it away. Back in the house, The stove crackled and hissed. He set water to boil, but didn't drink it, just listened. The valley had gone back to silence, but it wasn't the same kind of silence anymore. It held memory now. Not ghosts, not grief, just something still breathing. The next few days passed quiet. Roads reopened, power returned. The ice receded from trees in long silver tiers. Caleb chopped fallen limbs, cleared the gutters, did the work a man does when his hands need distraction. The barn stayed untouched. He walked past it every morning and night, but didn't go inside. Then the letter came, folded thin, typed on pale paper, slipped under the post office door in town. Warren Pike's name was stamped along the bottom, field agent for Western Trust. The notice was formal, direct. He had 2 months to pay what was owed, or forfeit. He read it once, then burned it in the stove. Later that evening, he walked the fence line. The land was soggy, soft underfoot, but the mule was grazing again, and the pasture had held. He found a pair of crows on the fence post. When he got close, they didn't fly, just stared. The barn door still hadn't moved. Inside the house, he cleaned the coffee pot, rinsed out the mugs, folded the same blanket 3 times before leaving it draped over the couch. The days had blurred again, but not in the same way they used to. The emptiness didn't ache as much. It pulsed, like a bruise still healing. Then, 3 days later, news came down from the diner. Dale Rusk had been found limping into town, bleeding from the thigh, dragging a busted trap chain behind him. He told folks a story about something big, said he'd caught it, said it fought back. He swore he'd seen it drag itself into the trees and vanish. Sheriff didn't say much, just told him to rest and stop drinking. But the talk didn't stop. Rumors floated through North Fork like steam from a cracked pipe. About something watching the trap lines, about prints too wide to measure, about a man screaming in the dark and crawling out of the woods with fear still caught in his teeth. Caleb listened but didn't add to it. He just stood on the porch each night, eyes on the trees. 2 weeks passed. Nothing. Then, one morning just before sunrise, he stepped into the barn and stopped cold. The air had shifted again, not in temperature, in presence. Everything was in its place, except one thing. On the inside of the barn door, where the wood met the latch, there was a handprint. Not full, not forced, just the faintest brush of fingertips against the surface. Wide, long, pressed so lightly that the dust still clung around it, untouched. A signature, a closing. He stood with his hand beside it, not matching, not mimicking, just acknowledging. Then he let the door swing open, light spilling onto the frost-crusted dirt. Later that afternoon, a new envelope arrived. This one from the bank again, but it was thicker, detailed, itemized. He didn't open it, just slid it under the stack and kept drinking his coffee. The quiet of the farm wasn't so heavy now. It still hung over everything, but not like a sentence. More like a coat worn through winter, familiar, necessary, warming only in certain spots. The rest you learn to live with. Ivy visited that Saturday. She brought a paper bag with rolls inside and a folded scarf she'd made herself. She asked if anything strange had happened. Caleb only smiled and said the barn was finally clean. She giggled and ran off toward the fence. He watched her disappear around the mule pen, then stepped back inside, sat at the table, and rested both hands on the wood. No one had said thank you. No one needed to, because sometimes the biggest kindness doesn't leave a word behind. It just leaves you the space to stand again, on your own, with nothing held, nothing owed. And somehow that was enough. That night, as the cold crept back in and the wind skimmed across the top of the house like a whisper, Caleb sat on the porch and watched the last of the light die behind the ridge. There was no sound from the trees, but his eyes stayed on them anyway. Because sometimes, when something sacred passes through your life, it doesn't slam a door or leave a trail. It just slips away so gently that the silence afterward sounds almost like a promise. Spring in North Fork Valley didn't arrive all at once. It peeled itself off winter like a second skin. The last of the snow retreated into the shadows of fence posts and tree roots, reluctant and gray. The earth thawed slow, greedy for water, turning Caleb's fields into deep, stubborn mud that sucked at his boots and filled the grooves of his hands with grit. The wind softened, but not kindly. It blew the ghosts of winter across the hills before letting them go for good. He'd been mending fence since sunrise, hammering back loose boards, tightening wire that had gone slack in the frost. The pasture didn't care about his debts or what had come and gone through the barn. It just wanted repair, and so did he. Some days his hands remembered what they were for before his mind caught up. Swinging the mallet, measuring the posts by feel, the same way he used to fix toys for a child no longer here. That morning he'd woken with the sense that something was different. Not wrong, just waiting. By late afternoon, the clouds parted, and the sunlight fell across the western slope like a memory he hadn't asked for. The mule stood still under the budding cottonwoods. The wind had paused. Caleb wiped the sweat from his brow, looked up from the post he'd just set, and saw them. 3 figures, standing just past the tree line. He didn't move. They weren't close, not near the barn, or even the pasture's edge. They stood still among the spring bramble, silent, shadowed, and unmistakably watching. The largest figure stood slightly forward. Her shape was familiar, even from a distance. Broad-shouldered, upright, still. Beside her, slightly behind, stood a smaller adult. Heavier, darker, arms crossed over a wide chest like a sentinel. And near their legs, half hidden by waist-high grass, stood the smallest of the 3. Caleb's breath caught before he knew why. It wasn't just that the child was real and upright and taller now. It was the way it stared at him. Not with fear, recognition. He dropped the hammer without meaning to. It landed soft in the dirt. He didn't reach for it. He didn't speak. His hands dropped to his sides, and he took one quiet step forward, boots sinking into the thawed mud. But he didn't cross the field, didn't approach. He knew better. They didn't wave, didn't signal. But the mother stepped forward, slow and purposeful, holding something wrapped in what looked like cured hide. Dark, oiled, bound with a single vine. She walked with care, her movements grounded and dignified, until she stood at the boundary where Caleb's fence ended and the land turned wild again. She didn't cross. She bent low and set the bundle against the base of the last fence post, then stepped back 3 paces, then waited. Caleb didn't move for a long time. Then, slow as the sun easing down the ridge, he stepped forward, past the fence gate, keeping his eyes low. Not submissive, just respectful, the way you would with a horse that hadn't decided if it trusted you yet. He approached the bundle, knees cracking as he knelt beside it. The hide was bound with a simple knot. No metal, no modern stitch. He undid it carefully, breath held, and peeled it back. Inside, he found gold. Not polished, not minted, raw, heavy, a placer nugget. Jagged, dull glowing, about the size of his palm. The kind of gold that whispered of rivers and pressure in old time. He blinked. He had seen men shoot over less. Beside it lay 2 more items. A stone shard, carved smooth, the color of wet ash. It shimmered in the sun like something ancient. Next to it, a black flint spearhead, napped by hand, edges sharp and clean, and folded beneath it all, worn paper. He recognized it before he even opened it. The page torn from his own ledger, the same creased edge where he'd once kept his thumb while staring down the numbers that spelled out the end of his land. But now someone had drawn across it in charcoal. Lines, motion, the figures unmistakable. A barn. Him. Kneeling. The shape of a child being held. A scene not copied, but remembered. Etched from within, not observed from outside. And tucked into the bottom corner, barely visible, a second scene. A trap. A man crouched in brush, watching. No names, no warning, just a truth laid down in ashen paper. When he looked up again, they were still there. The child stepped forward this time, just one pace. It tilted its head, blinking at him with slow curiosity. There was no urgency in the movement, just weight. It had grown, its shoulders broader, hair darker, but the eyes still steady, still familiar. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't need to. He nodded once. Slow. The child tilted its head in return, then turned back toward the woods. The family moved as one. Not rushed, not hiding, just returning to the place where light didn't reach unless it was invited. He watched them go until the last heel disappeared behind the dogwoods. Only then did he kneel again and wrap the items back in the hide with reverence. Not greed, not even surprise, just understanding. That night he didn't bring the bundle into the house. He left it on the table in the barn. Let the old wood and the quiet shelter hold it for a while longer. He lit the oil lamp and sat on a hay bale, staring at the bundle with tired eyes. Something had been completed, but not finished. Outside, the moon rose late, casting the ridge in soft silver. The air smelled like thawed bark and damp moss. He walked the line of the fence, checking the posts again, even though he'd done it that morning. It felt necessary now. Not out of duty, but respect. He paused near the gate, set a hand on the top rail, not far from where she'd left the offering. His fingers gripped the wood tighter than they needed to. He thought of the silence in the barn the morning they left, of how everything had been cleaned, arranged, restored, like they'd never been there. But now it had come back, not for shelter, but to remember, and to make sure he remembered too. When he turned back toward the house, he didn't feel alone. The land wasn't lighter, but it had shifted. He felt it, in the small things, in the quiet places, where things left unsaid lingered just long enough to be understood. And somewhere, under the moonlit boughs and cold spring wind, the forest kept its own memory of what had been given, and what would never be forgotten. Summer came early that year, dry and hot, the kind of heat that made the boards on Caleb's porch crackle even before noon, and turned the dust in the driveway to a fine, red powder. He moved slower in the mornings, not from age, but from knowing too well the weight of quiet work. The pastures greened up, the fence held, and the mule no longer flinched at the shadows near the tree line. But the bundle of fur and stone that had been left for him in the spring, it still sat inside the cedar trunk beneath his bed, untouched, unspoken. Some debts weren't meant to be spent. Some gifts were never meant to be used. The loan had been paid in full 3 weeks ago. He'd driven into town with a nugget wrapped in an old rag, handed it to a gold buyer behind a locked office door. The man hadn't asked questions, not out loud. Just waited, nodded once, and gave Caleb what he needed to keep his land. Caleb didn't take change. He didn't sign anything he didn't have to. He just took the receipt, folded it into the same envelope the bank had sent him 2 months before, and burned them both in his stove. Mabel had been watching from the window of her shop that day. When he passed through town the next morning for flour and tobacco, she didn't ask where it came from, just rang him up slow, her fingers resting on the counter like anchors. "You come into luck?" she finally asked, eyes steady. "Some," he said. "Not the kind that sticks." She slid the bag toward him. "Still, better than no luck at all." He didn't answer, just tipped his hat and walked out. Word spread, of course. Small towns didn't need proof to feed a rumor. Someone said Caleb found gold on his land. Others said he'd sold a hunting photo to the National Geographic. A few muttered about a legacy left behind by an uncle no one had ever heard of. None of it mattered. The ranch was his again. But it wasn't just his. Not really, not anymore. He locked the cedar trunk at night, not because he feared theft, but because the memory of that morning still lived too close to the surface. Some things you keep sacred, not secret, just untouched. By midsummer, the talk had shifted again. Dale Rusk was back in town. He wore a brace on his leg now, though he claimed he didn't need it. Said the wound came from a rusted trap that caught him by surprise. Said it was a cougar, then said it was a bear, then said it was just bad luck. But everyone remembered the night he'd limped into town, half crazed, bleeding from the thigh and muttering about something pulling the steel apart like wet wire. Since then, he hadn't stopped talking. Now he was drawing maps, showing people his traps, offering bounties for sightings. And every now and then, his truck coasted slow past Caleb's property, eyes behind the wheel narrowed and tracking. One afternoon, Ivy came to visit, skipping up the gravel path with a basket of cornbread and a note from Mabel. Caleb met her at the porch, noticed how her hair was pulled back tighter than usual, her dress slightly torn at the hem. "You okay?" he asked. "Fine," she said, too fast. I was picking berries, a little farther than Gran said I should." He nodded and took the basket from her hands. Inside was a folded cloth, still warm. "You smell like woods," he said. She grinned. "You smell like mule." But her laugh didn't reach her eyes. Later, when she was gone and the sun started sinking past the ridge, Caleb walked the edge of his fence line, just to be sure. At the far southern corner, past the creek bed, he found it, boot tracks. Too wide for Ivy, too heavy for her feet. Someone had been close, too close, and not long before. That night, he sat on the porch with a shotgun across his lap. The forest was too quiet. The wind felt like it held something back. He didn't light the porch lamp, didn't want to make a line of light someone else could follow. He waited until the sky turned blue-black and the trees vanished into each other. Then he heard it. 3 knocks. Steady. 1 pause. Then 3 again. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood slowly and looked toward the barn, where the door stayed shut and the mule kept quiet. The message was clear. Don't let them in. The next morning, he cut down the weak stretch of fencing behind the grain shed, the one that bowed and sagged and had too many gaps between posts. He didn't fix it. He didn't rethread the wire. He took it down. Let the brush swallow it. He knew why. A gesture in return, to hold the boundary on their behalf. It wasn't an offering. It was a promise. By the time Mabel stopped by that weekend, Caleb had cleared the brush near the main gate, too. She stepped out of her truck, squinting in the heat. "You fixing things again?" He shook his head. "Just making sure folks don't wander." She looked toward the woods. "You think something's coming?" He didn't answer, because he already knew it wasn't something. It was someone. A week later, Warren Pike showed up at the edge of the property line, dressed in pressed slacks, carrying a clipboard he didn't bother opening. He stood near the mailbox, tapping the metal with his knuckles. "Mr. Rourke," he said as Caleb approached. "Just routine follow-up. Land inspection. We like to confirm tax records match current use." Caleb stared at him. "They do." "Then it shouldn't take long." "I didn't say you could come in." Warren blinked. "I don't need permission." Caleb didn't move. The wind picked up behind him, and somewhere deep in the trees, a single branch cracked under weight that didn't belong to deer. Warren shifted his clipboard. "I'll come back with paperwork." Caleb nodded once. "Do that." That night he laid a small bundle of oats and dried apples just past the fence, near the place where the bundle of gold had been left. He didn't say anything. He didn't expect anything. But giving back, it mattered, even if no one ever saw it, even if it was taken by raccoons or birds or wind. Because sometimes kindness needed to echo itself, even if no one clapped. In the dark before dawn, he heard it again. 3 knocks, then silence. And in the silence, a breath that wasn't his own. By the time morning came, the oats were gone. But the footprints remained, wide, deep, still watching, still protecting. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Caleb knew the fence wasn't just a line anymore. It was a vow, and he was the one keeping it. The summers rolled quieter now, not because the world had changed, but because Caleb Rourke had. The weight in his shoulders wasn't gone. It had just settled into something he could carry without wincing. His steps were slower, his silences longer, but there was no edge to them anymore, just rhythm. It had been years since the storm, years since the knock on wood in the middle of the night, and the look in those dark eyes across the fence line. The pasture still held, the barn stood straight, and the house had taken on a kind of hush, like it knew not to speak unless spoken to. Ivy was grown now. She still visited sometimes, driving up the dirt road in a second-hand pickup, hair tied back, sleeves rolled. She'd knock once, no more, then step inside like she'd always belonged there, which, in some quiet way, she did. That summer, the porch had new wood. Caleb had sanded the railing himself, staining it a shade lighter than the original so the grain showed through. Some afternoons he sat there long after the sun had dropped past the tree line, coffee lukewarm in his hand, listening to the frogs return to the creek bed and the coyotes bark from the high ridge. There was peace in that. Earned peace. The younger men in town still talked. Now they called him that old coot with the gold, though no one ever tried anything. His fences were too well kept, his eyes too steady. And besides, most folks had already decided that whatever had happened back then, it wasn't theirs to touch. Some mysteries stayed rooted in the hills. Ivy had asked him once, just once. It was after supper. The air was warm and loose, fireflies floating like lost dreams in the pasture beyond. She stood with her elbows on the porch rail, watching the dark settle in. "Did they ever come back?" she asked. Caleb had looked at her for a long time, then reached into the pocket of his old jacket and pulled out a piece of folded paper. Edges worn, creases soft as cloth. He handed it to her. She opened it slow. A child's drawing, charcoal, smudged. A barn, a man, a baby being held in the arms of something not quite human. In the bottom corner, a shadow, watching. Ivy looked up. Her throat moved, but she didn't speak. He took the drawing back and folded it just once, tucked it away like it had never left his chest. "I see what I see," he said. "Doesn't mean I need to be believed." She didn't ask again. By August, the sun hung heavy like it didn't want to leave. Mornings came slow. Caleb fed the mule with cracked corn and carried water from the well, even though the house still had a working pump. Some habits weren't meant to be broken. That evening, he stepped out just as the sky turned that deep orange you only get after dry heat and long light. He carried his cup to the edge of the porch and leaned forward, elbows on the rail, eyes on the fence line, and froze. There, just between the trees, not close, not hidden, standing where the sun caught only the top half of its shoulders. A shape, tall, still, familiar. It didn't move, didn't wave, didn't call. It just watched. He didn't call out either. He didn't need to. His fingers tightened around the mug, not out of fear, out of knowing. He hadn't seen her in years, not since the spring she'd left the bundle. But he knew it was her, and she wasn't alone. He didn't see the others, but he felt them. Not menace, not distance, presence, like a song humming just below hearing. She didn't cross the field. She didn't need to. She turned, slow and quiet, and stepped back into the trees. But not before the wind shifted and something was left behind. The next morning, he walked the line like he always did. Checked the posts, nudged the wire taut, paused by the south corner where the old fence had once bowed. And there it was, a small bundle of straw. Not much, bound by a thin strip of hide. Clean, simple, sacred. He didn't touch it. Not right away. He just sat on the dirt, leaned his back against the post, and let the sun rise slow over the ridge. He didn't feel young anymore. He didn't feel old either. He just felt known. That night, he lit the oil lamp in the barn and opened the cedar trunk, pulled out the wrapped hide from all those years ago. He set it on the table next to the new bundle, the old beside the new. Two halves of a circle that no one else would ever understand. He didn't need to tell the story. He'd lived it. Some nights still, long after the stove had gone cold and the crickets hushed, he'd step outside barefoot and stand at the edge of the porch, looking into the dark. Not waiting, just open. Sometimes he thought he heard it. That rhythm. 3 soft knocks, then 1, then 3 again. And always, his hand would drift to his chest, resting just above the place where he'd once felt a child's first breath pulled from silence. No one in town talked about Bigfoot anymore. Not because they stopped believing, because the ones who mattered never needed to. They knew that kindness doesn't vanish. It leaves behind markers, straw left folded, fences repaired, traps disarmed in the dark. And sometimes, if you're still enough, quiet enough, long enough, it comes back, not to take, not even to stay, but to remind you that you were once the kind of person who opened a barn door and stepped back, that you were seen, that you were remembered, and that some bonds, even without names or language, don't ever break. They just return in the shape of a breath held between trees, or a shadow pausing at the edge of the world. And on the last evening before the first frost came again, Caleb sat on the porch, cup warm in his hands, and looked out toward the ridge, where light slipped like silk behind the firs. He didn't see her, but he smiled anyway. Because sometimes kindness comes back in ways the world isn't ready to believe. There are places in this world that never make the maps. Quiet places, tucked between ridgelines and riverbeds, where time doesn't move the way it does in towns, where silence isn't empty. It listens, where boundaries are more than fences. They're made of trust, of respect, of something older than language, passed from breath to breath, from heart to hand. And in those places, the things that matter most don't always speak. They show up, then disappear again, like wind bending the tall grass before dusk. And sometimes, in the middle of all that stillness, a choice is made. Not the kind that shakes the ground or makes the papers, but the kind that matters quietly. A hand extended without asking for anything back. A door left open, not out of fear, but faith. A line drawn not to keep something out, but to promise you'll never be the one who crosses it in the wrong way. Because kindness, real kindness, isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It lives in the pause before action, in the moments when no one's watching, in the soft resolve to do what's right, even when the world doesn't clap for it. And the truth is, most of the time, it doesn't. Most of the time, you love in silence. You protect in silence. You lose in silence. And you heal the same way. But silence isn't the end. It's where remembering begins. And if life teaches us anything, it's that not all debts are paid with words. Some are repaid with presence, with listening, with simply staying when it's easier to walk away. And sometimes, just sometimes, the things you send into the dark with an open hand come back, not to be owned, not to be displayed, but to let you know you were seen, you were heard, you mattered. Maybe we'll never understand everything. Maybe we're not meant to. But that doesn't mean we stop choosing decency, choosing grace, choosing to stand still, even when fear begs us to run. Because somewhere beyond the noise of the world, there's a quiet agreement between the wild and the willing. I'll leave you be, if you leave room for me to exist. And that's where the stories are. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for walking through this one with me. If this story left something in you, an ache, a memory, a bit of wonder, I'd be honored if you shared your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you're listening from. Let me know what kindness means to you. And if you'd like to be here for the next story, the next whisper from the woods, please consider subscribing and hitting that follow button. This little community grows because of people like you. People who believe that some stories are worth telling slow. Take care out there. And remember, sometimes the quietest moments hold the loudest truths.